Good day everyone and welcome back to the channel again. Today we're continuing part 3 of this little basic knife build, and we are doing the grinding post heat treatment. So what this first stage is I'm just cleaning up the carbon that's happened during the heat treatment. You get a little bit of carburization and you just need to clean that up. I'm using an old belt to do that rather than mess up a new belt. Normally that carbonisation is a bit hard, but it has sucked some carbon out of the surface of the steel, so you want to clean it off, and you want to clean off a little bit of steel underneath it just to get back to some good hard steel. So yep, that's all we're doing at this stage, just tidying it up. This is the longest part of the actual grinding process, is just cleaning that carbon up and getting a nice flat blade. Any sort of bend that you did have, even with the aluminium plates, you will get minor bends in it. You're talking tiny amounts, but they will leave you with little sections where you struggle to get the carbon out, and you've got to cut down to get that out. So yeah, this part of the grinding process is the longest part of the process, and it just what it is. You just got to try and clean up those little bits and pieces. Okay, here we are marking the center line for the grind. I'm just going to color it in with a texter. I don't actually mark it to center. I mark a pair of railway track lines on it. So I mark it from both sides. It doesn't really matter whether the line's dead in the center or not if I've got two lines. It just helps to guide me as I'm grinding the bevels in. Just dragging it across that little jig there. Little jig will scribe a line in there, and in that black texture mark it's going to leave a nice clear line that's reasonably easy to see in person, a little bit harder to see over the camera. And there's my jig. It's one I bought at a knife show. Not sure who made it, but works fantastically. Here we have me trying to show those lines, but it doesn't look like they're showing too well on the camera. As I said, there's a little pair of lines here. Okay, here I'm putting on the tool rest that I use for my angle jig, and just making sure that the tool rest is nice and square to the platen on the grinder. And there is my tool jig. It's one of the first ones that came out as a commercial one a little bit ago. It comes from Czechoslovakia. It's not the greatest in the world, but it's better than a homemade one. There's some good ones around now. Creative Man does a fantastic one. It's got a file jig attached to it and a grinding jig. Now, a lot of guys on the Facebook forums and that sort of thing talk about doing freehand grinds. I freehand grind as well, but if I'm doing a production knife that's just got straight bevels on it, I'm just going to put it in the jig and just grind it through on the jig. It's just a lot easier. So here I'm using a 40 grit belt just to rough in those bevel lines, just hogging off material just to suck it in. You can see I'm quenching it about every 3 passes. And there I'm going to a newer belt just because it wasn't taking off material quick enough. Quick check for square and off grinding again. You can see there where I turned the speed up, it was a bit low, and all of a sudden we got a lot more sparks coming out, so it's cut a lot better. And so, yeah, as I keep saying, we all make mistakes, that's for sure. And this is the one thing I really do not like about this jig. It's changing the sides of the blade. When I've got to flip it over to go the other way, it takes forever. And this is fast forwarded as you're watching it. And yeah, it takes a bit of time for me to play around and swing it over. Okay, here we're changing over to a 60 grit belt. Going back through, doing it again. We're hog the majority of the material off. Again, we're checking for square. So we've hogged the majority of the material off, and we're just starting to refine those scratches, starting to get a bit nicer of a line. And here we are, flipping it over to the other side again. Yeah, one of these days I do need to get a better jig, because this one's starting to irritate me a fair bit. As I said, it's very handy, but yeah, it is painful to work with. And the tool rest comes off, and we're grinding the flats now. Now we're doing it on an angle this time, instead of the straight up and down that it was with the first cut. So we're opposing the lines, and you can see the difference between the lines. Instead of being straight up and down, they should be on an angle when you're finished. Alright, changing over to a 120 grit belt, and now we're straight up and down again. So each time we change on the flats, we're changing the angle that we're cutting on. And that way you can see the grinding marks from the last belt and make sure they're all gone before you move on. Back on with the tool rest. And back onto the jig. And we're just going to clean up the lines on the 120 on the jig. There I'm putting a bit of texture on. If you put the texture on it, it just helps you to see that if you ground all that texture off, you know that you've gone past the previous scratches. Where you've got to run the same direction, the texture just makes it a wee bit easier to see that. And now we've got a 240 grit belt, which is running on the bevel section. And now we're running the 240 grit, running on an angle on the flats. Swapping over now, 400 grit, which is my final cutting belt. And we're running straight up and down. And then we're finishing off the bevels on the 400 grit. And that's the final grit I cut on. All that I've got left after that is to do a polishing belt, but I do not do that until after I've marked it.